living memory of his friend, Colonel, knight, and gallant person of Britain, Sir Philip Sidney. Because Spencer had a very high regard for Sir Philip Sidney. So this elegy was dedicated to Sir Philip Sidney. And why elegies are written? When we think about elegy, why they are written? They are written because death is the subject on which one can discuss, one can think about future, one can have philosophy, one can express feelings for someone. One can touch the heart of the people by giving their feelings to his someone who is near to his heart. So this elegy, Estrophel by Spencer for the loving memory of Sir Philip Sidney, is, I think, maybe the first elegy in English, and it is also very famous. So now let us think about what is the contribution of Sir Philip Sidney. Sir Philip Sidney was a very gallant person and a very deep thinker of poetry. Sidney was a very deep thinker of poetry, serious thinker. He gave many definitions of poetry. What is poet? What is the contribution of poet to the society, to in the social surrounding? How poetry starts in the mind of the poet. Even Sidney, in his introduction on the defense of poetry, he defends poetry. He saved poetry in the sense that poetry is a very serious art. Anybody cannot start writing poetry. Poetry is not everybody's cup of tea. Poetry is a very serious aspect. The work of poet is full of imagination, full of knowledge of many subjects. As we know that Sidney and Spencer, even Shakespeare also, they all are fan of Greek literature. They loved Greek literature. Virgil, Homer, Euripides, Tasso. Sidney even paid tribute to Aristotle, Plato in his defense of poetry. He remembered them. His defense of poetry is a very famous work, especially in criticism. The first serious critic in English is Sir Philip Sidney. Because before Dryden is there as an important critic. When we talk about Sidney as a critic, or as a serious thinker about poetry. I think Dryden followed Sidney in many ways, because Sidney says that poetry is a very serious art. Poetry should instruct. Poetry should delight the audience. Poetry lead to virtuous action. As we know that the Greeks were master in many subjects: philosophy, science, literature, mathematics, theology, psychology. So, true poet will have many imagination. True poet will have knowledge of many subjects. When we read Sir Philip Sidney's The Defense of Poetry, and after you read Dryden's view on criticism, view on poetry, Dryden said, "It is not enough that Aristotle had said so." Dryden was bold in comparison with Sidney and Spencer. Sidney especially, because Sidney has become very famous as a critic also, when he is talking very important things about poet and poetry. So what Dryden says, it is not enough that Aristotle had said so. For Aristotle, he draw his models from Sophocles and Euripides. We know that Sophocles and Euripides were very famous at the time of Aristotle, and Aristotle had a very high regard for Sophocles and Euripides. It is not enough that Aristotle had said so. If he had seen ours, he might have changed his mind. So, Dryden challenges Aristotle, while Sidney follows Aristotle. For Sidney, Virgil, Aristotle, and Plato, they are the ideals, models. They are the heroes for Sidney. So in Sidney's poetry, all types of Greek atmosphere, Greek language, muse and goddesses of love and goddesses of hatred and songs and music, everything is there. Typical Greek atmosphere we can find in Sidney's poetry. So Sidney gave importance to Greek poetry because he had only that model of Greek poetry before him. So in some way Sidney criticized the poets also. In a very harsh way, Sidney said that the culture of poetry or the culture of poets is not very sound in Britain. Poetry is not strong in Britain at the time of Sidney. But Sidney is very serious about poets. Poets are least liar. Very nice definition. Friends, if you want to have the definition of what is poet, who is poet, who is a true poet, what are the characteristics of true poet, what is poet's contribution to poetry, to society, the place of poet in the society. So he has a very high regard for the poets. The poets are the less or the least liar. Poet can't lie. Poets are always true. Of course, they are imaginative. They are describing unimaginative facts. But poets are true to their imagination. Poets are not liars. Poets are noble, gentle. That's why they are poet. As we have to remember that what Plato said, poets should be banished. Poetry should be banished. So the thought of Plato and Aristotle were different, but Sidney follows Aristotle, as Aristotle had also very high regard for poetry and poets. Then Sidney gave unusual definition, sort of new definition of poetry and poets. Poetry is the companion of youths and camps. It is very true. Who reads poetry? Old people won't read. Then people from 40 to 60, they will read less poetry. But the young generation, young people, they are fan of poetry. Youth is always serious about poetry. Youth lives poetry, loves poetry. So poetry is for youths, poetry is for camps. Then he says poets are like soldiers. As we note that Sir Philip Sidney was himself a soldier. He was an MP at the age of 18. So Sydney he had a very good career as a politician. He was an MP at the age of 18, and in the later age he joined the army as a soldier, became a leader, and went on to fight against one country, and they were defeated. And unfortunately, when we read the end of Sydney's life, he was shot by the enemy, and he suffered a lot by Gagarin, and he died. So even in his last breath, as I said earlier, he gave glass of water to another soldier. So in this way, Sydney gave his life for poetry. So many critics said that what is poetry? Poetry is Sydney's life itself is poetry. What is poet? Sydney's work is poet and poetry. So for poetry, critics have a very high regard for Sydney, and we have a very good poetry of Elizabethan period from Shakespeare, Spenser, and Sydney. I am thankful to you, friends, for listening me very patiently. Thank you.
SANDHAN, All Gujarat Integrated Classroom.
સેટેલાઇટના માધ્યમથી જોડતી કડી એટલે સંધાન.